Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials had feared, monitored closely, and prepared contingency plans for over the past several months. A military repositioning that unfolded not over weeks or days, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that shifted the strategic calculus along Ukraine's northern border. 72 hours that triggered emergency consultations across 3 continents. In fact, 72 hours that forced the White House to issue one of its most direct warnings to Moscow in over a year. What Russia did this week crossed a line that Western intelligence agencies had hoped would hold through the winter. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with urgency, and with a determination that has defined their resistance for nearly 3 years. For 9 weeks now, there had been indicators, not official statements from the Kremlin, not formal military announcements, just signals picked up by satellite monitoring and intelligence networks that Russia was preparing something operationally significant. Now, Russia has been unpredictable, yes, but they have been methodical in their unpredictability. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a predictable pattern of escalation and de-escalation. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and NATO headquarters this past Monday was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor troop movements and logistical supply chains know the indicators, the increased rail traffic moving military equipment westward, the activation of reserve units that had been demobilized months earlier, the repositioning of command and control assets closer to operational zones, the sudden communications blackout across certain military districts, all of that went quiet. And whenever Moscow goes quiet in the middle of an active repositioning, it means something is about to get loud. Western officials have seen this pattern before, the deliberate information void that precedes a significant military action. It's a tactic designed to create confusion, to delay response times, and to achieve tactical surprise even when strategic intentions are broadly understood. Like early Tuesday morning, U.S. intelligence assets detected what they described as a major redeployment of Russian ground forces, including armored battalions and artillery systems that had not been positioned. This close to Ukraine's northern frontier in over 8 months. These are the kinds of assets that Moscow only repositions when they are signaling something very specific. Okay? Preparation for a renewed offensive, establishment of a stronger defensive posture in anticipation of Ukrainian counterattacks, or leverage building ahead of potential diplomatic negotiations. Intelligence analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know is that Russia was changing its operational posture along a strategically sensitive corridor. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts military posture without diplomatic explanation, even by what might seem like incremental measures, Washington pays attention. The deployment included not just personnel, but sophisticated air defense systems, electronic warfare platforms, and logistical support infrastructure, the kind of comprehensive package that suggests sustained operations rather than temporary maneuvers. This wasn't a training exercise. This wasn't routine rotation. Mm-hmm. This was force projection with strategic intent. The ultimatum issued by the White House on Wednesday evening was not normal. It was not routine diplomatic language. It was not symbolic posturing. It was urgent and direct. Okay. Senior administration officials speaking after emergency National Security Council meetings described Russia's move as, destabilizing to regional security architecture, inconsistent with previous commitments regarding force deployments, and perhaps most importantly, a miscalculation that would be met with concrete consequences if it led to further aggression, But ultimatums only work if the target believes there will be consequences for ignoring them. Okay. Ukraine did not wait to find out. In fact, their response over the past 48 hours was among the most coordinated and strategically focused operations we've seen in months. Here's what we know. Within 18 hours of the Russian deployment becoming publicly confirmed, Ukraine launched precision strikes against military logistics nodes inside Russian territory near the border region. These weren't the limited strikes we've seen previously targeting fuel depots or isolated command posts. These were carefully selected targets, supply routes, ammunition storage facilities, and command coordination centers, the kind of infrastructure that Ukraine only targets when they are preparing to disrupt a larger operational plan. Tonight, multiple defense sources confirmed that Ukrainian forces executed strikes on at least 7 high-value targets, including rail junctions that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was increased military throughput. Ukraine struck before Russia could establish fully operational defensive perimeters around newly deployed assets. They hit transportation corridors used to bring reinforcements forward. They hit logistics storage areas that were likely preparing to support extended operations. They hit the communications infrastructure that was coordinating between newly arrived units and existing command structures. In other words, Ukraine targeted the connective tissue of Russia's deployment. The infrastructure that would have made it fully operational and sustainable. And this is what made the White House's warning so urgent. Russia's repositioning wasn't just symbolic saber rattling, it was operationally actionable. It represented the kind of force concentration that could support renewed offensive operations if left to consolidate. And Ukraine, understanding that, fully responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike civilian areas. They didn't target infrastructure unrelated to military operations. They hit logistics nodes that would degrade Russia's operational tempo. They hit command facilities that would disrupt the coordination of newly deployed forces. And here's where the story becomes even more strategically significant. Defense analysts now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Western support for Ukraine after months of political debates in Washington and European capitals about the sustainability of military aid. And Moscow wanted to see whether the West would respond decisively or whether political divisions would create hesitation. But instead, the opposite happened. The White House didn't delay or equivocate. They issued a statement that was so direct, so unambiguous in its language, that even seasoned Kremlin watchers took notice. And you don't get Moscow's attention easily after nearly 3 years of escalatory rhetoric. But this week, Washington did. European security analysts, speaking with international media under condition of anonymity, described Russia's deployment as probing action, a way to measure Western cohesion and Ukrainian capabilities simultaneously. But Ukraine proved this week that they remain both tactically proficient and strategically aware. Their strikes were not only rapid, they were targeted so precisely that they avoided collateral damage while achieving maximum operational disruption. That precision matters because it shows two things. It shows that Ukraine's intelligence gathering and targeting capabilities remain highly effective. It shows that Ukraine is not acting desperately or reactively. They are executing a coherent strategy designed to impose costs on Russian military planning. As reports continued coming in throughout Wednesday and Thursday, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian long-range strike capabilities carried out attacks on ammunition depots over 80 kilometers from the front line, forcing Russia to disperse supplies and complicate their logistics planning. Us, Ukrainian intelligence-directed operations targeted communication nodes that had been established, thought in the last 10 days, to coordinate between newly deployed units. Ukrainian forces operating unmanned aerial systems reportedly struck fuel storage facilities used by Russian mechanized units to support armored operations. Okay? This wasn't just reactive defense. This wasn't just an symbolic retaliation. This was operational disruption. This was strategic messaging. And strategic messaging is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain effectively since the initial phases of this conflict failed to achieve their objectives. For every tactical advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Russia's broader operational timeline. Remember, Russia thought this conflict would be resolved in weeks. They thought Ukrainian resistance would collapse under initial pressure. They thought Western support would be symbolic rather than substantive, but nearly 3 years later, the exact opposite is happening. Ukrainian forces continue to defend their territory with increasing sophistication. Western military assistance has evolved into comprehensive support, including training, intelligence sharing, and advanced weaponry. International diplomatic isolation of Russia has deepened rather than eroded over time. What makes this moment so strategically significant and so potentially volatile is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when President Putin is under multiple sources of pressure. Domestic economic challenges are mounting as sanctions compound over time. Military casualties continue to accumulate without achieving decisive strategic breakthroughs. International diplomatic isolation limits Russia's options for breaking the current stalemate. Nationalist hardliners within Russia demand more aggressive action, while pragmatic voices warn of overextension. So Putin is balancing these demands while maintaining a military campaign that has proven far more costly and protracted than initially planned. And when leaders in that position make sudden military moves, they're not necessarily doing it from strength. They're often doing it under pressure. They're doing it from the need to demonstrate resolve to domestic audiences or to create leverage for potential negotiations. The White House's ultimatum, now communicated through multiple diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to accept further destabilization along Ukraine's borders without consequences. And senior administration officials said plainly that Russia's deployment was inconsistent with the goal of de-escalation and regional stability. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing, we understand the implications, and we will respond if this leads to renewed aggression. You don't usually hear that tone from the National Security Council unless something serious is at stake. The statement went further than previous warnings by specifically mentioning potential responses, including additional sanctions targeting Russia's defense industrial base and expanded military assistance to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky addressed his nation and international partners in a forceful, urgent speech Wednesday night. He said, "We will not wait passively while threats are positioned against our people. We will defend our sovereignty with every capability at our disposal." He said, "We call on our partners to see this moment clearly. Russia is testing resolve, and our response must be unified and decisive." And he said, "Ukraine has proven for nearly 3 years that we will not be intimidated, we will not surrender our future, and we will meet aggression with strength." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become and how critical continued international support remains. Okay, here's what makes the situation even more concerning from a strategic perspective. Russia's latest deployment wasn't isolated to one sector. Okay? Along with the northern border repositioning, Russian naval forces also increased activity in the Black Sea region. Russian air defense systems were moved to positions that extend their coverage over previously contested airspace. Russian electronic warfare capabilities increased operations targeting Ukrainian communications infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Moscow moves multiple capabilities simultaneously across different domains, it means something larger is underway, either preparation for coordinated action or establishment of a more robust defensive posture. Strategic analysts are now considering several possibilities about Russia's intentions. One is that Russia is preparing for a renewed offensive operation timed to coincide with political transitions or potential shifts in Western support dynamics. Another is that Russia is attempting to establish stronger defensive positions, to consolidate territorial control and create leverage for potential negotiations. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to create military pressure that could fracture Western unity or force Ukraine into accepting unfavorable diplomatic terms. But this week, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for diplomatic processes to play out. They didn't appeal only to international institutions. They didn't limit themselves to defensive postures. They struck decisively at the operational infrastructure supporting Russia's deployment. What we're watching now is a test of strategic resolve. Russia wants to see whether Western support for Ukraine will remain consistent despite political pressures and economic costs. So, Ukraine wants to show that they retain both the capability and determination to defend their sovereignty regardless of external political debates. Washington wants to prevent further escalation while maintaining credible deterrence against Russian aggression. And European allies want to prevent a broader conflict while supporting Ukraine's legitimate defense needs. Tonight, we've heard from NATO officials who are now closely monitoring developments along the entire border region. They say Russia's deployment represents a significant change in force posture that will require adjustments to NATO's own defensive planning in Eastern Europe. They say Ukraine's response demonstrates continued tactical proficiency and strategic awareness despite nearly 3 years of sustained conflict. And they say Russia's decision to reposition forces is likely part of a broader reassessment of military strategy intended to achieve objectives that have eluded them through conventional offensive operations. But Ukraine is not passively accepting this new reality. In fact, Ukraine is actively shaping it. Their response this week, rapid, precise, and strategically focused, sent a message to Moscow that Ukraine will impose costs on Russian military planning. And it sent a message to Washington and European capitals that Ukraine remains a capable and determined partner worthy of continued support. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Moscow hoped to achieve with this deployment. But what we do know is that the White House's ultimatum was timely and necessary. It clarified Western positions at a moment of potential strategic ambiguity. It reinforced support for Ukraine's right to self-defense. And it established clear expectations about the consequences of further Russian aggression. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next several weeks. If they de-escalate and pull back newly deployed forces, this moment will be remembered as successful deterrence through combined diplomatic pressure and Ukrainian defensive action. If they continue to build up forces or launch new offensive operations, both Ukraine and Western allies have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to impose costs. And tonight, for the first time in several months, Moscow appears to be recalibrating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet after a major military move generates strong pushback, it means they are reassessing. Okay? It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because this week, Russia learned something they have learned many times over the past 3 years, but seem to keep underestimating. Ukraine will not be intimidated into submission. Western support, while debated politically, remains strategically committed, and military pressure alone will not achieve Russia's stated objectives. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine retains the will and capability to defend itself. The West remains united in supporting Ukraine's sovereignty, and Russia faces a strategic environment that has not bent to their pressure despite nearly 3 years of conflict. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.